forward. And we haven't had the opportunity to do this sort of deep dive. I mean, when I look at the map and I look at the number of houses that are fully self-contained dwellings that could be available for long-term rental, you know, I think that's pretty stark. Then again, there's always been holiday houses.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's hard to know how big a change it is in terms of the volume. One of the things I'm really concerned about is a bit hidden, and I'd like to talk to explore this when they join us, which is that self-contained studios and converted garages or secondary dwellings or granny flats type accommodation aren't counted as unhosted if they're separate to a main house and someone lives in the house. And that's actually the accommodation I'm most concerned about in terms of long-term rental, because they used to be on the long-term rental market for lower rents than, you know, big full houses. And my sense, which is anecdotal though, is that they've disappeared and they're Airbnb. And I'm also really conscious that some local people rely on Airbnb income.
Yes.
And there's an interaction between interest rates increasing and, you know, ways that people have structured their finances to cover their mortgages. So I think it's a really complex, tricky thing, and I'm really glad we're diving into it.
Same. Yeah, and I remember one of our first consultations, we had folks who were running a different kind of, you know, they were short-term accommodation providers who were feeling really squeezed by the emergence of Airbnb and the different level of regulation that they were encountering, which I know has been addressed since then, but I think it's still a live issue. So I can see that Murray and, oh, I've got a question here, just one sec. So I can see that our guest speakers have joined us, and Ryan, you popped a question in the meeting chat that I'll get to in a minute. We have just done a little round of discussion around what we're particularly interested in. It wasn't fulsome. We didn't get to go, you know, talk to everybody, but we just, you know, got a bit of a sense of what prompted people to come along and their areas of interest that we can note down, Peter and Murray, for our Q&A later. But before we get to that, I just wanted to introduce you both. So Professor Peter Phibbs is a geographer, a planner and a social economist with decades of experience in housing research and advocacy. We've been working really closely with Peter the last couple of years because we both share an interest in developing a community land trust in the Australian context. So welcome, Peter.
Thanks very much. Yeah, great to be here, everybody. Yeah, thank you for the invitation.
And then we have Murray Cox, who is a data activist and Airbnb expert. Murray developed the Inside Airbnb tool that we've all been looking at, which scrapes data from the Airbnb website to develop these interactive maps that we've looked at for various localities. That was a huge intervention in this space because Airbnb makes it quite difficult to get reliable data on the impact of their platform on localities. So, you know, that's when people like Murray can step in as data activists and provide these kinds of tools for communities like us. As I already mentioned, Murray's based in New York. So for him right now, it's something, am I right, Murray, like 2:30 a.m. for you? So
yeah, that's right. But hi, everyone. I'm happy to be here.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you very much for staying on. Yeah. So yeah, thank you very much both to you for joining us, and I'm going to hand over to you now, Murray, for a bit of an introduction and overview of your work.
Sure. Just give me a second to share my screen.
Yeah.
Just one second. Okay, great. So hopefully you can see my screen.
Beautiful. Looks great.
Great. Okay, so as Rose mentioned, I'm the coordinator and data activist of Inside Airbnb, and that project started in 2015, so it's about 8 years ago. I never thought I'd still be doing this project. I started collecting data for New York City, which is where I lived at the time. And in February 2015, I was actually in the Blue Mountains at the time. I'm Australian, although I live in New York. I released Inside Airbnb New York City. And then soon afterwards, I added other cities like San Francisco, Sydney, or Greater Sydney, Portland, Oregon. And I've had requests throughout the world to add cities. Soon we'll be adding entire countries, so cities and towns and regions for entire countries, including Australia, New Zealand, Canada, United States. Earlier this year, I created a not-for-profit, the Housing Justice Data Lab, just to help sustain the project and also work on other projects related to the right to city and the right to housing. And so if you haven't seen it already, I have a website, Inside Airbnb, and so you can get data and some reports, some of which I'll mention today, and we can go into more detail later. I had a request, I think it was about a year ago, to add Bellingen, and so instead of just adding that local government area, I added the entire mid-north coast. It was a little bit more efficient. And if you go to insideairbnb.com/mid-north coast, you can get to this page and you can filter by the local government area of Bellingen. And from that, you can get some headline statistics of the number of Airbnb listings across the region, the types of properties available, entire homes, private rooms, shared rooms, or hotel rooms. The majority are in entire homes, as you can see. Activity, how often we estimate they're being rented out. And so it's my understanding that in that region, there's no limits on how often they can be rented out, but it's an important statistic. Whether they're licensed under the state program. And we really just look at whether any license number exists. We don't check the validity or whether someone's using duplicate or fake license numbers. And then the hosts also have a setting with the minimum number of nights that a guest can stay. As you can see, most hosts have their Airbnb listing set to a small number of nights. There's a few that have a 35 plus category. And it's my understanding that in New South Wales, 90 days is the threshold for a short-term rent versus a long-term rent, although I've seen some conflicting information, but the majority of Airbnb listings are available for short-term rentals. And listings per host. So a host can have multiple listings. 44% of Airbnbs in Bellingen are multiple listings where the host has more than one listing. And so when you're thinking about whether someone lives in that property and might be renting it out part-time, 44% of the listings are either property managers or people that have multiple listings. And on the website, actually break down the top hosts. You can see that McGraw estate agents, obviously a property manager, and some of these either might be property managers or people with multiple properties in the region. Some of the reports that were done over the years, in 2016 in New York City, we discovered that Airbnb had secretly removed those hosts that had multiple listings. Airbnb was releasing some data for the city and for journalists, and they wanted to make their community look less commercial, and so we caught them removing 1,000 entire homes, and so that it started to turn the conversation in New York around some of the tricks that the platforms like Airbnb were doing to try to minimize the commercial nature of Airbnb. I've also done some research with universities surveying different cities to understand the challenges from short-term rentals, how they've been regulating it. And so I'm also after the call, I can provide a link to these slides, so you can you'll be able to click on these links to download the reports. In 2020, I also did a report for a European parliamentary group to talk about how platforms were operating and some of the impacts of short-term rentals around the world, but with a particular focus on Europe. And these are some of the subjects that we look at: the myth of cooperation, how locations are hidden. Many times the platforms have illegal listings, they're breaking the housing laws. But I'd encourage you to download that report if you're interested in finding out a bit more. Some of the data analysis that we did, we looked at 8 different cities, and we were trying to categorize the Airbnbs into home sharing, like a single room, or someone just renting out their home for a short amount of time, semi-commercial and commercial. And commercial would be someone that had multiple listings, or they were renting it out more than 90 days per year. And so across different cities, and these are obviously bigger cities in Europe and the United States, in some of the cities, there's a lot of commercial activity, like a majority of commercial activity, and some are less. Some of these cities have effectively regulated. For example, Amsterdam has, and as you can see from this table here, the cities adopt different regulatory or policy schemes. Some have registration systems, some require the platforms to disclose data, some require the platforms to do some checking, like for example, that listings are registered. And then there are also sometimes rules that cities implement. Like for example, in Amsterdam, there's a 30 days per year cap. So you can't rent out your home more than 30 days per year, and you have to be the primary resident. In places like New York City, it's illegal to not be present when you have guests staying in your apartment or home. And so there's quite a varied approach around the world in how to regulate Airbnb or other short-term rental platforms. The recommended regulatory approaches based on feedback from cities, as I mentioned, mandatory registration, platform accountability, and platform data sharing. Interestingly, New South Wales has most of these policy features. What I think New South Wales doesn't have is they don't have many restrictions on the type of activity that that short-term rental hosts can do. As I understand it, only a few regions have some type of cap, like for example, Sydney and other parts, and Peter can probably talk a little bit more about that. I've also done some reports for communities in the cities that the data were collected, for example, Dallas, and I'd encourage you to download that report as well. And we look at the number of entire homes, the growth of listings. So in Dallas, Airbnb listings were growing 44% per year, and then increased 600% since 2016. We can also see, we can also analyze the number of Airbnb listings compared to housing stock, and also the number of vacant and available for rent housing units, to look at the impacts on renters, who are usually the most vulnerable in many communities. This is something interesting that's happened in a few cities. This blue line are short-term rentals on Airbnb. You can see that increasing, and then as the city introduces regulations, the number of short-term rentals reduces. But the red line are longer term rentals on Airbnb. So some cities, they have peculiar reactions. The market reacts to regulations by shifting from short-term rentals to long-term rentals on platforms like Airbnb. And sometimes platforms put the hosts in these categories, the longer-term rental category. So I don't really expect that to happen in New South Wales, but it's something interesting that's happened around the world. And places like San Francisco, who regulated short-term rentals early, they introduced caps on longer-term rentals between the 30-day and the 1-year period to stop these platforms taking advantage and also taking housing off the market in that category. So yeah, I've tried to just keep my slides short here, just to give you a bit of introduction to my work, and hopefully I can answer some questions later on in the evening.
Thank you, Murray. It's very interesting. Any questions now? People happy to wait till the end? Happy to wait? Okay, I mean, over to you, Peter.
Sure. Now, look, first, what a shout out, Murray, staying up to 2:30 in the morning. That's
Yeah, I reckon.
very impressive. I think, maybe Belgians should send you, I don't know, one of the Belgian treats to, keep you awake. But I guess a bit hard to deliver electronically. But and also let me give you a shout out to Murray. I first met Murray when I was at Sydney University. God, Murray, how long is it now? Must be 2016 maybe.
Probably
just
15.
started the project. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think you I reached out and you're in Sydney at the time. We caught up. And since then, like Inside Airbnb has been such a important resource for researchers. I with a colleague, Nicole Gorin, had an attempt at collaborating with Airbnb to do some research way back in 2017, and it was just a snow job basically. So we published our first paper, which I think I might have circulated, about Sydney and Airbnb in end of 2016. And Airbnb in Australia contacted us and said, would you like to do some research together? We said, yeah, that'd be good. They invited us over to San Francisco. We went to their head office, met all the honchos, a lot of glad handing. I specified some data tables. We talked to their data people in Singapore, which at the time was exciting. And then we were promised, every week for about the next 6 months that the data was coming next week, and it never turned up. So it was a complete snow job, basically, trying to keep us inside the tent. Anyway, it was very frustrating. So in the absence of the providers sharing data, it's been really useful that we've been able to use Inside Airbnb as researchers. And I did actually one of my PhD students did a literature review at the end of last year, I think maybe a little bit longer ago. And literally we could find hundreds of academic papers where the main data source was Inside Airbnb. So it's been really useful from a research perspective. I think I'll just make a couple of observations just to get the ball rolling. One is when people say, when they claim that short-term rentals have no impact on rental markets, which is a very common claim by the platforms. And the way they say that, they say, well, we only represent, in Hobart, it's 1% of the total housing stock is on is single dwellings, entire homes, not primary residence in Hobart, and they say therefore it's impossible that we'd have ever an impact on the market. Like the thing I'd point to there is really the unfortunate international pandemic. It was obviously incredibly frustrating in many ways, but for researchers it was very interesting because it provided a natural experiment in what happens to rental markets when short-term rentals contract. So in many parts of Australia, the border's shut. We didn't have international tourists or even interstate tourists. So a lot of people converted their short-term rentals to long-term rentals. And we saw in many cities quite sharp reductions in rent and much better availability of rental stock. And if people are interested, there's some good research pieces on that. Some that I've done with some colleagues at Sydney Uni, and UNSW also did a nice piece looking at Sydney. So I did some work in Hobart, and Hobart City, which is sort of like Sydney City Council, it's the inner Hobart. It lost about 110 short-term rentals to long-term rentals, and rents came down 12%. Very interesting. So that's quite a useful thing to look at. You know, if you're trying to look at what's going on in your own market, have a look at what happened in COVID. So I think that's incredibly useful. The other thing is, the other thing that I think is probably useful for you guys is having a look at the experience of Byron Shire, that has been trying to push back against short-term rentals for a long time. The system operates in over New South Wales, like you probably realize, is there's a 180-day cap. Okay, so it's like a cap you have without having a cap. You know, 180 days is a lot of days. So a lot of people would struggle even if they had their properties available full time to rent them out for 180 days. But that's the New South Wales cap for non-hosted accommodation. And Byron Bay wanted to change that to 90 days. Okay, they had a scheme where they wanted to, for large segments of Byron Bay, change it from 180 to 90. But for areas in the middle of the Byron township, like in the sort of their CBD, they wanted to change it to 365 days, right, to try and compensate. They're saying what we want to do is let's just have it in sort of our commercial zones. And for the rest of the Shire, let's make it 90 days, because we think we do that, we'll actually end up reducing the amount of short-term rentals, and some people will be encouraged to put it back to the long-term rental market. The New South Wales government had a study done about that. They were trying to persuade the council to go back to 180 days. Council stuck to its guns and wanted to run the 90-day scheme. Now, the government originally said they could actually implement that themselves through the planning framework. But just before the election, the minister caved into pressure from short-term rental owners, I suspect, and said that they couldn't do it themselves. What they'd have to do is get a planning body called the Independent Planning Commission to look at the evidence for and against and write a report to the minister before anything could happen. So things sort of stalled. What was really interesting in the report, I was a bit involved. I gave some evidence to sort of that inquiry process. The Independent Planning Commission, they had a 3-person panel gathering evidence on the issue. They actually got some independent work commissioned by Mahuri. But what was interesting, they said, no, don't make it 90 days. That's not enough. Make it 60 days, you know, because your market's so stuffed, unless you do something, you're really going to be in trouble. So they said, make the cap 60 days. And let people, if they want to try and extend beyond 60 days, put a development application in and make them argue the merits of the case. You know, that they're not, you know, if they can convince you they're not going to actually affect the long-term rental market, maybe you'll give some additional permits. But other than that, just let them run the 60-day cap. Now, that's why it's sort of a bit of a re-regulation trend where I think we're now seeing probably across the country, I've had phone calls from government officials in a couple of states recently who are wanting to revisit their short-term rental regulation because the rental markets are in such stress across the country. They're just making the obvious point that if you could actually redirect from stock from short-term rentals to long-term rentals, that's a really immediate way to provide some relief to rental markets with tight vacancy rates. You don't have to wait for, you know, someone to build a project. You have that immediate conversion. So there's a bit of a re-regulation theme, you know, happening. And I think if the Byron Shire were able to introduce that change, I think it'd be pretty difficult for the government to push back against other coastal councils or you know, holiday spots like Bellingen to do the same thing. So I'll send Rose the link for that report so she can share it. It's pretty easy to find on the Independent Planning Commission, but I think there's some hope there. The other thing that's interesting, and I could hear Kerry raise this issue when you're having those introductory comments, is that some of the properties, okay, you've got to realize that you've got a different setting in a holiday destination like you guys than you have in the middle of a capital city, right? Traditionally, you've got a lot of holiday homes, and if those holiday homes, simply have moved from an estate agent to a short-term rental platform, it's probably had very little impact on your market. So, you can have quite high numbers of short-term rentals, and maybe the long-term rental market hasn't changed. I think what the thing I'd encourage you to do, and I did this to some extent at Byron, is have a look at the New South Wales rent and sales report, and have a look at how your rental market is traveling in terms of the total rental bonds that are active, right? That'll give you an idea of the size of the rental market. And what you're looking for is situations where that rental market is starting to decrease. Okay, if simply you've had a switch from real estate agents to Airbnb and other platforms, that's probably not going to really knock your rental market around. But if your rental market is shrinking because investors particularly are buying long-term rentals and moving them across to short-term rentals, and I suspect that some of that went on during COVID, that's more a sign of alarm. I think like Airbnb in particular always argues that stock on Airbnb isn't used for long-term rentals. So that's another thing you could do through a research piece, is maybe through the council, you could get a list of addresses. People have to register online. If you could get their address, through your sort of local networks, or indeed maybe through the rental bond board, you might be able to find out whether those properties were previously rental properties. I've been able to do that in Tasmania. It's been quite interesting in that the government, the Tasmanian government, has got the worst Airbnb regulation probably in the world. What's really funny down here is when the government announced their policy, Airbnb described it as the best policy in the world for regulating short-term rentals. Now, normally, if the person you're trying to regulate says it's the best policy in the world, you might be a little bit suspicious about your policy. But in the great Tasmanian tradition, the ministers were saying how proud they were that a little state like Tasmania had been acknowledged by, this internet giant, that they were punching above their weight for policy. Anyway, shows a little bit about maybe the quality of ministers in Tasmania. But anyway, it's a very light touch policy. But one of the good things that they've done is that there's an act, short-term, it's called the Short Stay Accommodation Act, and the platforms are required to register with the government, okay, the names and addresses of every property that's been active in that previous quarter. And through Shelter Tasmania, I've been able to get access to that list, which I'm sure, so it is available for research purposes, which is good. And I've been able to match that, not against the, unfortunately, the Tasmanian Rental Bond Board. They refused to cooperate on that research project. But I've used a core logic database called propertyvalue.com.au that scrapes data off most online listings. And through that, I've been able to establish that in Launceston, about 60% of the short-term rental properties were previously on the long-term rental list. In Hobart, it's about 55%. Okay, that it's not completely thorough because some people manage their own property. They're not advertised online, so they're not scraped on that site. But if people say, well, none of the properties from the long-term rental market, you can sort of disprove it through that analysis. In New South Wales, the Rental Bond Board's probably more likely to give you access. They've got quite a tradition of providing access to researchers. So maybe even through Michael Darcy might be able to convince one of his colleagues at Western Sydney Uni to have a look at that, as it'd be a good student project where with the cooperation of council, you could get the addresses of the registrants and then match that against the Rental Bond Board. I think that'd be a useful piece of research. because that'll help sieve out the holiday home things. If they've already been holiday homes, you won't see them. If they're switched, you'll see them. So I suggest you have a look at maybe doing that, but also just having a look at the rent and sales report to see how the number of total active bonds have been traveling. Because again, if you've seen an increase in short-term rentals and a decrease in long-term rentals, that's a pretty bad outcome for your market. But yeah, I'd also probably just reach out to Byron Bay, and the person's name will jump into my head in a second, but I'm sure they'd be very happy to talk to neighbouring councils about their process. It's been a long struggle for Byron Bay. They've been, they've been sort of up against it, but the council's been quite committed, particularly the mayor, and they're, I think, about to try and change their LEP to use that 60 days rule, which would certainly be a good precedent for other councils trying to have a more aggressive policy. Yeah, they're an interesting devil, short-term rentals. You know, people say they're housing companies. They're not housing companies. They're lobbyists and IT companies. They almost know nothing about housing. You know, people are providing their housing, but they're very skilled lobbyists, and you put a lot of resources into it. You know, and they've got a SHMIC IT platform that helps them attract hosts. But yeah, the thing that annoys me most about them is they're fairly blatant liars about lots of things. Including, you know, we know about how rental markets work, and we've known for 50 years that you only need a small change in rental properties to change vacancy rates and rents, and they disengage with that whole area of scholarship and just try and run the a counterintuitive view, which is unfortunate. Anyway, maybe that's all I'd like to say for opening comments. Really interested to hear comments or questions, and could maybe direct people to some things to read if they're interested. Thanks.
Excellent. All right, we've already got. Thank you for that, Peter. That was really useful. And I can see, we've got people around the room who are, I think, pretty keen to lead some sort of deep dive research project just on this topic. Yeah, so we'll definitely keep that conversation open. I can see Kerry's already got her hand up to ask a couple of questions, so I'll throw over to Kerry, and so, just pop your hand up and I'll keep a little running list.
Thank you, Rose. Hi, Peter. I've got two questions. One is, do you have any sense about how much duplication there is between platforms like Airbnb and Stays, for example, which was around before Airbnb and used in a local context? So just wondering whether we know anything about duplicate listings or not.
Yeah, certainly, like the Tasmanian experience is interesting because I get the listings from 3 or 4 platforms, and there is quite a lot of overlap. A lot of people list on multiple platforms. Yeah. So I haven't actually counted that explicitly, but I've just sort of noticed it in passing. Airbnb still dominates the market. Like in the Tasmanian context, they've probably got 90% of the market, so we would tend to focus on their activity. But a lot of people multiple list, particularly I think if they're really trying to increase their patronage. Yeah,
Thank you.
I might even have a look at that. Good thing to do on a plane. I've got the listings. I could just sort the addresses and count the duplicates.
Great, thanks. My second question is about the sort of regulatory controls that are possible, and you talked about the sort of number limits of days, but I think I read somewhere that Shoalhaven or somewhere was looking at a rate differential. Yeah. And I'm wondering if you know anything about that or any other responses that are beyond the limiting the days.
That's interesting. Hobart City Council just voted in to double, essentially make Airbnb commercial rates. So that doubles the, rating for Airbnb properties. That went through council, and it's a bit of a mixed council, but, the councillors saw the benefit of that, because they really, as Murray showed, a lot of the bigger companies really are, major businesses. And it helps to highlight that they're businesses and not, someone just renting out a bedroom to make a bit of extra cash.
Yeah.
So they're charging, again, not for hosted accommodation, but for non-hosted accommodation, they've essentially doubled the rates. I think that's not a bad, it's something that is like a useful signal to the community that if you're a business, you have to pay rates like a business. And certainly created some interesting debate down here in Hobart. The platforms obviously hate it, but quite a few councils across the country have done it. Brisbane's increased their rates. Some smaller regional councils in Tasmania have increased their rates. Like I'd argue in the, there's especially with the regulatory system they've got in place, the compliance costs are pretty high. You've got to go and find out if someone's operating their property, whether they've registered properly. Sometimes you've got to go and address like noise complaints and, party houses and stuff. So it's probably quite logical, given those costs, that you try and recover some of that through a rating system. I think the other advantage it does carry is if you're an investor and you know that the rates in Belgium are double, and somewhere else on the coast they're not, they might decide to go somewhere else. It might just be a signal that it's not a welcoming community for a short-term rental investor, and maybe they'd be better off in a place where they haven't got that rate addition. And that's I'm not exactly sure. I don't know enough about local government law in New South Wales, but it's quite a straightforward process in Tasmania, and just essentially a motion of the council meeting is all you need to change the rates. That might be worth exploring.
Yeah, I did want to, can I just add to what Peter said? There are some other approaches that other places have tried. Some is having a limited number of licenses that you can apply for. So they might set it so that the impact of housing is sustainable, or the impact of community is sustainable. In some places, like for example, in Barcelona, it's a cap across the entire city. In some other places, like for example, in Austin, Texas, they have a cap per census tract. So the number of short-term rentals in the census tract is tied to the number of housing units in the census tract. So it's trying to eliminate any concentrations in a particular part of the region. Some other cities also have different policies for commercial or investor-owned short-term rentals versus primary resident short-term rentals. Sometimes cities might have different rules also for accessory dwelling units or granny flats. So I think that, and there can also be many cities, as I mentioned, have, they ban short-term rentals. So especially unhosted short-term rentals, so that you can only rent out rooms as opposed to entire homes or apartments. So there are other approaches that people can take. And I think in Australia, either the approach has been light touch or just having some type of cap, and usually the cap is quite high.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Rose. I was wondering if there's any examples of where kind of the flip side of that, where it's been incentivized for long-term rentals. So rather than encouraging short-term, actually incentivizing long-term rentals.
That's and again, Tasmania's been at that. It's been like quite a bizarre policy where they have this incredible light touch on the short-term rental market, but if you convert your short-term rental market into long-term rental market, the government will give you a quite a generous subsidy for 2 years to do that. And you sort of think, if the government, and the Tasmanian government is seriously broke, it strikes me as quite bizarre that they, rather than striking at the source of the problem and reducing the number of short-term rentals directly through regulation, they've got a market system. Okay, it's not. I think they subsidise 200 properties a year, but I think it's like a $10,000 subsidy per annum to a landlord.
That's huge.
Yeah, I know. But again, that's the nature of Tasmania. There's not many places where you'd encourage the activity on one hand, and another agency would give you money to stop doing it. But yeah, that'd make an interesting thesis, that wouldn't it? Trying to work out why that's a logical policy strategy. But yeah, that's what they do. I think
is that subsidy paid in perpetuity? They have to convert for what's the tenure?
It's just for 2 years. Yeah. So they've got to convert. They've got to show evidence it used to be a short-term rental, and then they've got to, the rents are capped. They've got to take a tenant nominated by the government. That's in housing need.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions? Yeah, up the back.
I just wanted to say, I don't know if anyone's seen the advertising recently on Airbnb where there's a couple of women in an Italian flat, and there's a woman host, middle-aged, and it's all really homely. It's very homely scene, and it's branded Airbnb rooms at the end of it. And it's just quite an interesting. She gives advice where they could go and take a photo, and there's a cat and there's a cozy little room. So it's just it's interesting, going back to what Murray was saying, is that the campaign to paint it as a non-investor, it's a personalised thing. And we know that maybe it started like this, but the reality of it, it's just an interesting branding campaign. That's just a comment. The second thing was just, with the scraping, Murray, is Airbnb ever tried to put any tools in to stop the scraping of the Airbnb data inside Airbnb?
Did you hear that question, Murray?
Yes, I did.
Okay.
So Airbnb, I would say that they could have done a lot more to make it more difficult to collect data. I probably ran the project for about 4 or 5 years before I started encountering significant difficulty. But I've been able to get around it. And so I don't think that they're technical people who are targeting projects like mine. They're just doing some type of generic blocking. And so I've been able to get around it. It does increase my costs. Like my primary cost is something called a proxy server. It's like a VPN that lets me anonymously scrape their website. And so, so I use that to collect the data.
Mm-hmm. Oh, behind me, Zephyr.
I'm just wondering, I suppose this is a question for both of you, but just to go to what is the sustainable percentage of holiday and short-term rental in other communities? I think the two things I'm thinking of is, if you look at somewhere like Hobart, it says Airbnb says they've got 1% of the total housing stock. That's about 10% of the rental stock.
Yeah.
A quick back of the envelope calculation for us, we're about 3% of housing stock is Airbnb, just by the figures that people have mentioned tonight, and a quick look at the census data. So we're quite likely at a 20 or 30% between holiday housing and short-term rentals. In areas where you've looked at regulating the number, the total number, I think we group them together because I think they have a similar effect. What is the percentage of housing stock that's sustainable to have as both holiday and short-term rental, especially in a rural community where you've got a smaller total than, say, a city?
Yeah, I'm not even sure yeah, whether there's like an answer for, exact answer of every community. I think it's going to change according to the circumstances. But those figures you quoted, yeah, like in research parlance, they call that sort of short-term rental density. And one of the reasons Hobart is so whacked is the density is quite high. Okay?
Yes, please.
So Hobart, it's 9%. Okay, of the total private rental market is short-term rental. In Sydney, it's about in Sydney it's about 2%, and in Melbourne it's about 3.5%. So I think it really depends on the size of the place to set what that proportion is, but also it'll probably depend a bit on historical patterns. If you've got a place that has had an established holiday market for a long time, maybe those numbers would be higher. So I think the interesting thing is have a look at whether they're changing and what's happening to your long-term rental market. If you've got population growth, if people are moving to your community, you need your long-term rental market to be growing in terms of the number of long-term rental properties. So that's the other issue you probably want to have a look at, is what the sort of growth rate is. Hobart is like a lot of international cities. You could think of places like Vancouver, where they're very attractive. International students will pay a lot per night. So it makes short-term rentals very competitive compared to a long-term rental market. And in Hobart, because you've got household incomes in Tasmania about 40% of 40% less than the rest of the country, the affordability in the long-term rental market is a bit constrained. There's only so much you can charge people for them to afford it. So tourists who are very happy to pay $300-400 a night for the right property really knock your long-term rental market around. Yeah, I'd encourage you. I think that density figure is important. It's a very useful metric, but you want to have a look at it over time, and you want to have a look at how your long-term rental market's moving before you'd try and come up with an estimate.
But and I think you should be tracking the vacancy rate as well to see how much pressure the rental stock is under.
Yeah.
And affordability.
Yeah.
So vacant house building.
Yeah, traditionally, the vacancy rate is different than the US, Murray. Ours are, and I think the measurement's different too. But traditionally, you need a vacancy rate of over 2%. Otherwise, there's likely to be some pressure on increasing rents. Hobart got down to about 0.4, 0.5, and rents are going up 10% a year, and probably a lot of other cities are like that. The SQM data measures vacancy rates. I don't know if they they're up that far, but also sometimes the local real estate institute does it, which is probably a more accurate measure. They just survey their members.
Yeah.
Do we have an idea of how much of an economic drain to local economies Airbnb is? I guess that's like the people who own the Airbnb properties, the investors. Are they local people? Are people living in communities, or is it people from, for instance, in Belgium? Do we have an idea of is it the majority of the owners actually live in Sydney or Canberra, in which case the majority of the dollars being spent in the community are actually being drained and siphoned out of the community back to those areas? Because that'd be very different to if it was rental, where the majority of the money could be going back into our local economy. It seems like it could be a significant economic drain.
Yeah. Again, that's something you can do some research on. In the Tasmanian context, a lot of them are locals. They're Tasmanians. But I guess the other thing is what Airbnb spend a small fortune getting consultants to do, PwC to do studies on the economic benefits of Airbnb. So they go and talk to Airbnb guests and ask them how much they paid and would they have come to the place if there wasn't a short-term rental. So they'd push back against that data. I think the thing that, and I was trying to do this at Byron Bay, I did some work for the council at Byron Bay, is that what Airbnb guests tend to do is really, benefit the restaurants and bars and stuff. Whereas if you haven't got a long-term rental market, a lot of the other service sort of industries that you provide, like, childcare or, hairdressing or, all those range of things that people aren't going to use on a weekend, they tend to suffer. Okay, so you get a bit of a skewed local economy. You get a lot of hospitality and not much in the more enduring service sector. So we never sort of count that, in those economic studies. But a long-term renter, they're there, 52 weeks a year. They're going to spend a lot of money in the local community. A lot of the Airbnb properties are sort of weekends and holidays. So you get that unevenness in the revenue streams for business.
Lauren has a question.
That's a good researchable question, that one.
Yeah.
Yeah, something that I've done, for example, in Dallas, and it would be easy to do it in Belgium. In the data that I provide, every host, I collect information that they provide, and one of the pieces of information that each host self-selects is their location. And so it's very easy to classify those locations as being in Belgium or other parts of Australia, or even other states. And so, for example, in Dallas, Texas, and this will be different in every city, only 51% of the listings were associated with a host that had self-selected their location as Dallas. So 49% of the listings were listed by hosts who lived outside of Dallas, more or less. And so I can, and that's in the data that you can download from my website. You probably just need some basic spreadsheet skills to do that, and I can help you do that if you'd like.
Thank you. Doran, did you have a question?
I was wondering, you've touched on various cities, whether each of you has got a city who you could call a good model, something that is inspiring about them. I mean, Amsterdam sort of floated in my mind, but yeah,
Thank you.
something inspiring.
What do you think's an inspiring city, Mary? You probably know more about the world scene than I do. What's something that's really struck you?
I mean, Amsterdam is a good example. They survey their residents a lot in terms of trying to understand what's important for the residents. And they have a quite restrictive policy, but they still do allow the activity to benefit both tourism and allow the residents to make a few extra dollars. I'm really proud of New York City, which have kept true to their housing laws and have banned Airbnb, apart from renting out rooms. And there's actually, the city is being sued by Airbnb right now. They had oral arguments actually today, and I was part of an amicus brief, a friend of the court, opposing their lawsuit. Yeah, but I think it is important to understand the tourism needs of the region. And so a ban might not always be appropriate, but I think just really understanding the different needs of the region, and so I think it's really up to you to design the best system. But I really think you have to think through, well, how is it going to be enforced? How is your local government going to be able to work either with the state or with the platforms, whichever model. I mean, I think one of the challenges also with New South Wales and most of Australia is the state government controls a lot of housing policy. And so I think, as Peter mentioned, the fight in Byron is really important. And so I think even supporting their fight, I think would help your region as well.
Yeah, I think Byron are really, worth looking at because they've trying to make it evidence-based. They've, been at it for a while. They've certainly had a lot of negotiations with the state government. So I'd have a look at what they're doing. I think the thing that really strikes me about it, it's hard to, what we've tried to do in a lot of places is have just one set of regulations for the entire state. And, that just seems so silly because in some communities where you've got a lot of excess stock, you'd want to convert all your empty stock into short-term rentals probably as a way to trying to get some tourism in your town. If you're, looking at Western New South Wales, where people on the coast, on either coast like yourself, it's a very different proposition. So you need an ability, I think, to have some local discretion, and you have an ability, your local council to actually tune that process. So that's where I think like a permit process that's not in planning jargon, sort of complying development, where you don't really have to do much. You've just got to, have a house that doesn't leak. Whereas if you needed a process where you actually needed a permit that was like merit-based, then if your housing market was under stress, you just say no. And if your housing market had some capacity, you might say yes, and you'd time limit the permits, and that way you could tune it to the local, housing market. Because things move. Sometimes housing markets have had it, other times they've got some capacity. So you don't want to lock yourself in. And I think that's what Byron's trying to get at with their DA system. So they're trying to make one of the conditions when you're actually the person that's assessing an application, what the vacancy rate in the market is, and what the changes in rent have been in the last 12 months as a way of trying to see whether there's some capacity to issue another permit. Yeah, I just got a question in the chat, Rose, about insurance.
Yes.
Yeah, has Peter looked at how insurance can influence how properties are used for Airbnb? The host is supposed to declare it to their insurance company. That's what they're using it for, and that usually means an increase in premiums. But I don't think it's been like an obstruction. Unless in some cases the person's insurance company won't cover the Airbnb risk, that might be discouraged people. Usually, that usually means they can get insurance, but it's an extra cost.
And I think there's a follow-up comment there about feedback from Milestone, which is a little coastal village in our shire, is that Airbnb properties are not good neighbours. Affected residents may offer a local political base for LA action to constrain such properties, a la Byron, to specific zoning. I'm not following the second chunk of that, but the first part I think is something that a few people here have commented to me who have lived next door. I know Kerry and Marg are currently managing what that's like, living next door to an Airbnb property. And, the loss of connection as well as just having strangers and a lot of noise and disruption. Yeah.
And then, I know I've had to go at two questions.
No, please jump in.
Another issue. And I can't really frame this as a question, but one of the things I think we're facing is that over the years when Housing Matters has tried to advocate around Airbnb without, I think, and we really do need to do some proper research. But the economic development side of the administration within council has really pushed back.
Yeah.
And their argument is that we really rely on tourism. You have cultural tourism and festivals, and Airbnbs or short-term host rentals are the dominant form of accommodation for that sort of tourism. And so we weren't able to get any traction previously when we looked at this with some of the people working within council, and the politics of the council has changed a lot also in terms of it's hard to get a sense about how engaged the new council is around housing. But that issue in terms of the economy is real. And just going back to Rose's comment, the other thing we've seen happen is that the regulated holiday accommodation providers that have serviced apartments or, you know, purpose built, the bottom's entirely fallen out of that. And most of those providers have sold. And that used to be a dominant form of holiday accommodation, but that, you know, they couldn't compete with unregulated Airbnb. So that's part of our backdrop. And I'm just interested in any, I guess, reflections about other regional communities. And we've mentioned Byron.
I think that, and that is a good argument, you know, like it, obviously, you know, it does encourage tourism, and in a lot of places on the coast, tourism is your bread and butter. I think, you know, you're trying to say, well, you're not trying to close the short-term rental market down. You're just trying to constrain it so it doesn't eat the rest of your long-term market up. And allies in that, in the Byron argument, have been businesses that are hospitality businesses that just said, I can't run my business because my workers they come up here, you know, they get a job as a chef and they come up here and think they can find a place to live, and they can't. They just go back to, you know, wherever they came from. So they can't maintain their businesses. So
and we're in that boat now.
I think the argument is around balance. Yeah, is around balance. You've actually got to have both. You got to have some places for, you know, workers to live if they're going to come up here and support the tourism sector, and you've got to have places for tourists to stay. But you've got to get that balance, you know. And Byron's not trying to rub out short-term rentals in Byron. It's just trying to stop them getting any bigger. You know, essentially, you know, their concern, trying to get that balance right, because you tourists provide they obviously, like I was saying before, they provide that short-term injection of expenditure, but so does a long-term, you know, so does a long-term chef or a long-term, you know, retail employee. You know, they're spending 52 weeks in the year in community. So that's an economic injection from, you know, from them as well. And if people can't find anywhere to live, they're not going to move in. I mean, that's one of the arguments the council's been running in Hobart. They're sort of saying the state government's got a strategy of trying to double the size of Tasmania by 2050. They won't be able to do that if people have got nowhere to live. You know, you're going to triple the number of tourists and you're not going to double the number of permanent residents. So trying to get that balance in right. And sometimes in an argument, your employers are much better advocates than, you know, maybe you guys. Get your employers to push that case, because we've
been in discussion with the Chamber of Commerce here, who are increasingly taking advocacy around this, particularly in relation to hospitality. They just can't retain casual staff because they don't have anywhere to live, and some of them are going to really young staff, like kids that are still living at home, but they're not experienced, and then they're not able to operate in the way that they want to operate in a lot. And some of them are closing some days per week. And the Chamber of Commerce is, you know, actively engaged in this space now. The issue about no housing for local workers is really starting to bite in this area.
Like, you know, Byron's Bay's restaurants were serving food on paper plates, you know, because they can't get any staff to wash the dishes. So, I think they're a good ally in that argument.
So we've got someone in the chat box who is new to the Learning Circle. I think Ryan's joining us from Coffs, which is just, you know, a regional city not far from us. And they've just shared that they can speak on this because they're literally living in a shed because they can't afford rent. They're a service worker in Woolgoolga. We've got Zephyr and then Andrew.
I just wondered if we could overlay the secondary dwelling debate. Like, we've just recently house sat some friends down the coast who had an Airbnb and they live in on site, rent out a couple of 1-bedroom places. Friends of mine are doing a similar thing. I wonder whether encouraging councils to fast track people putting in a secondary dwelling, which then becomes almost like an on-site caretaker that spends an hour a day looking after the Airbnb and also does their barista job or they're a nurse, or, you know, so it becomes a solution. Like, is there any indication that those two strategies are overlapping? And also, how many Airbnbs that are whole houses, how many of them are 4 or 5-bedroom houses and how many of them are 2? Is that in your data? Because I think it's quite different. Because you may find you've got a local worker lives in the secondary dwelling and then maintains the Airbnb and then fits within a better model. Or it might be that the family live in the house and they Airbnb the secondary dwelling. Just seems as though we need to increase stock. Secondary dwellings is a good way to do it.
Yeah, well, it's and Peter might be able to talk about this, but it's my understanding that most accessory dwelling units or granny homes, the purpose of them is to increase density rather than building apartment buildings. And so I think to turn them into tourist accommodation, I think it defeats the planning purpose for those types of dwellings. It's difficult to tell with the data whether people are short-term renting out a dwelling on the same lot or whether it's a standalone lot. And so I think that should be the role of the regulators to or the local government to be able to set some rules for that type of activity. And in my experience, some cities allow that type of rental and some cities restrict that type of rental so that they might allow the host to live in one building on the lot and then rent out, short-term rent out, and other cities don't allow that. They only allow people to rent out the property in which they live. The other question about data about bedrooms, that's in the data that you can download. It's not in the maps, but if you download the data, there's bedroom information, so you can analyze that as you like.
Yeah, thank you. Andrew, you had a question?
I was going to say, just in that we were talking about tourism, like I was just last week presented to a North Coast tourism symposium, and one of the things that was kind of shocking to me was this, I think, naivety that all their projections of growth in numbers and revenue to 2030 and beyond just had no bearing, no reference to the climate crisis. And the word climate wasn't mentioned like once in all the presentations until I got up and did mine. And I was saying to them, like, all your graphs are meaningless after 2025, 2030 because of this. So I think putting all our eggs in one basket when it comes to, like, you know, this like the Airbnb market or the short-term renting market is so tourism focused, but tourism is so volatile because it's so it's much, you know, exposed to floods, fires, and other sorts of climate unpleasantries, of which we're about to get a heck of a lot more. Whereas people in long-term rentals, they sort of might not inject these sort of like large amounts of money in short periods of time, but they're more stable, and so the economy has a more stable basis. Does that ring true?
Yeah, sure. I think that's the point that Warren's trying to make. You know, if you've got a long-term worker in a house, you've got like a steady income stream, you know, across the year. Whereas the tourist market tends to be, you know, in the holiday peaks. So you've got to cater for those peaks, and, you know, that causes certainly management stresses for council and the rest of the community. So yeah, no, and I think you make a good point around, you know, climate risks. You know, people aren't going to travel to an area with, you know, really high fire risks or fire outbreaks or, you know, flood risks. So, you know, you got to try and manage your economy to maybe think beyond just a tourist lever as, you know, the only solution for regional New South Wales.
There was an example, I think, Peter, down the south coast of a region that was impacted by the 2019-2020 bushfires. And I think local government tried to take some leadership to incentivise folks with Airbnb dwellings to pop it back onto the long-term rental market just through letters, you know, think about the community.
Yeah.
Do you know how successful that strategy was?
Yeah, I don't. Yeah, I think that was Eurobadella, wasn't it? Yeah, the mayor sent a letter out to everyone, you know, the rate players. Yeah, I don't know. I suspect maybe not incredibly successful, but you know, perhaps some you know, ethical landlords took it to heart and but yeah, I can't say I follow it up. I might have a look at that, Rose. Don't take it as a question or notice.
Yeah, sure.
See if I can find anything out.
Okay, we've got two questions. I've got,
apologies.
sorry. I do know one local woman who pressured her mum to take their secondary dwelling off Airbnb and put it on the long-term rental market just by like kind of just bullying her into it, shaming her into it. So maybe that's the way, it's just to get.
I shamed my ex.
There you go.
And I said, you can't put that on it.
I just can't.
And
Oh, you know.
how hosting locals in long-term rental.
There you go.
He's a better man.
So maybe, you know, we've talked about that a bunch, haven't we? At HMAG, we've often said we just need to really push this campaign of, you know, trying to encourage or nudge people to make that right.
We did that social media campaign during COVID, actually. That actively encouraging people to quit there. And that, I mean, we couldn't get any data, but it had lots of interest on social media and it looked like there was some sort of response.
Yeah.
And then we know that lots of those properties went back to Airbnb because there was, you know, people who were on social media in those properties having to find somewhere else to live.
Yeah, and I guess when I have taken a stroll around the map that you've made for us, Murray, there are some folks making pretty decent amounts of money, right, out of Airbnb. So it's really difficult to find the right kind of incentive that stacks up for those people financially when they look at what they can make from short-term versus long-term rentals. Yeah, I think we had two questions. We have Jane and then that's all. Yeah.
Not a question, an observation. So as Becca said, we've just now sat at head for a month in a property that has the main house and then some other sort of studio spaces. And that property in itself is sort of borderline as to whether those spaces would be appropriate for a long-term rental. So it's kind of like, that's kind of okay. Probably someone could live in there, but you know, but the two of the neighbouring houses were big houses owned by people in Sydney that sat empty for 3 of the 4 weeks. And they came up for 1 week of the month. And they do list it on Airbnb, but they didn't have any Airbnb people while we were there. And what I was going to say in terms of what Andrew said about the economic drain, it's not just the economic drain, it's the social drain. So, you know, Zephyr and I went to have a spot of tennis at the Hat Head Tennis Club, and the courts are just in total disrepair. And someone said, oh, it's nice to see someone using them. And, you know, Hat Head on a Friday afternoon between 4 and 6 happy hour, the median age is probably 73. So, you know, you've got this community whose population is older people and, you know, people from Sydney who visit 1 week of the month. And so that mixture in demographics. And, you know, the people who would be living there and would be active in the tennis club and raising money to replace the tennis court coverings are not there.
Because they can't afford to live there.
Yeah.
And probably a third of the housing has got holiday rental signs out front.
I reckon it's more than a third.
Yeah.
Yeah.
2/3. And, you know, and the other thing is talking about workforce issues, hospitality, it intersects with our social fabric where it's like aged care workers. So I remember seeing a post on social media where someone was pleading for somewhere for a couple who were both aged care workers because they were living in a garage.
Yeah.
And, you know, where are we at when we can't house our aged care workers?
Yeah, or put them in shipping containers.
Yeah.
I was just going to ask, sorry to ask the second question. legality wise, we know that Uber, my understanding was that digital disruption, it comes along and just smashes its way into the society. I mean, how legal is Airbnb? I guess that might depend on jurisdiction. When, like, your actual hotels have to get a DA, they have to have regulations. I mean, one set of regulations, and then on the alternative, I think Michael Darcy said to us that we can't take the property rights of the owner.
Central.
How do we, if we took away the property right of letting that out, could there be any bad repercussions of banning all whole home things, you know, by just people selling, people going broke, you know, this or that? So I just think that we've let it run too long with no regulation, basically, and unwinding it, even if there was consensus to do that. Could that, if we took away the property right, how many people have bought on the assumption that they can rent it out for $400 a night and then can't pay the mortgage, I guess? So
unintended consequences of intervening now for investors and others,
Yeah, that's a good point. I think a lot of the certainly the regulation they're trying to introduce in Hobart City, they're trying to ban short-term rentals in residential zones. But it's not retrospective. Okay, so if you're already in, you stay in, but no new customers, you know, and the idea then is over time, as you know, uses change, someone that had a permit will stop using it, and the city will grow, so the impact will reduce. But yeah, usually there's you know, some sunset clauses or, you know, some clauses to try and mitigate the impacts on existing punters. But the point I'd raise about that is, you know, people are making a pretty healthy return out of Airbnb. Certainly they are in Hobart. And, you know, if you're an investor, there's a risk return curve. And you'd have to really be an investor with your head deeply buried in the sand, not to realise that across the world, there's been various regulations, you know, against Airbnb, and that it is a risk of doing business. Regulations will change. You know, if you were, you know, making 2% out of Airbnb, you know, maybe I'd be really sympathetic, but, you know, some Airbnb owners, particularly the larger ones, are making windfall profits in Hobart. And if they couldn't expand their business and make greater profits, I don't think I'd be feeling all that sorry for them. But yeah, certainly, certainly you don't want to make, you know, retrospective regulation for someone that's invested their life savings in a product. You know, so you have to think about that when you're designing the regulation. But the big enemy in a lot of places is just the growth, like the figures Murray was showing about the annual growth. If the market keeps growing, they can really swallow up long-term rental markets. So even if you can stabilize the market, that's a good outcome.
Well, on that note, I had to update a presentation that we give that includes a section on Airbnb, and this presentation we had put it together November last year, and then we delivered a presentation for the New South Wales Governor in June, towards the end of June, I think. And in that span of time from November 2022 to June 2023, an additional 30 or so dwellings had jumped over onto our map. So I was really, you know, interested in that, as well as just, you know, an uptick in how much money people were making on average. And so it was just interesting to just go in and kind of update our data set and just see this sector's growing.
That's why that rate strategy that Kerry mentioned before mightn't be a bad, you know.
Yeah, and I mean, that's in the context of a rental crisis with, you know, very low to zero vacancy rates. You know, in 2022, 2021, we had a 55% increase in rents, you know, in migration of folks from the city post-COVID. It's incredibly tight market.
Yeah.
Anything else anyone wants to add? No. So it sounds like there's still lots left on the table for us to research and get our head around, but yeah, very much grateful to Murray for, you know, taking on this project with us over a year ago to scrape data and develop a map for us so that we can begin to, I think as the Inside Airbnb tagline says, it's something like data for a better debate, you know, a data informed debate. You know, that's the first step. There's still lots for us to wrap our head around, but, you know, we're much better informed having had you both join us over the last hour and a half. So thank you very much, Murray and Peter.
Our pleasure. Our pleasure.
You're very welcome.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Cheers, everyone.
All right, we'll say goodbye. Thank you very much, guys.
Bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
See you, Murray. Talk soon.
Bye, bye, Peter.
Yeah. Get some sleep.